Hi, and welcome to Race and Ethnic Relations. I'm Stephanie Hansard. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about caste systems, specifically the caste system in the Indian subcontinent. Then we're going to talk about uh, W.E.B. Du Bois on the study of the Negro problems. Then we're going to talk about Eduardo Bonilla Silva's article outlining his concept of structural racism, followed by his writings on color blindness from the text Racism Without Racists. We're also going to pose some discussion questions for Thursday and look forward to next week. So, first, we're going to talk about caste systems. Aulette describes caste systems in her Global Perspectives on Race and Racism's book. Um, and she focuses on the caste system in India, although she's careful to point out that there are other caste systems around the world. And in fact, Du Bois might argue that the United States has historically had a caste system as well. And there are those who would agree with that assessment, including Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Caste. So the caste system is a hierarchy rooted in Hindu religion, with Brahmins at the top of the hierarchy and Dalits existing kind of underneath the hierarchy. They're not just at the bottom, they're outside the rules of social order because they're considered to be so beneath normal society. Castes are based on occupation, with Brahmins being the priesthood, the kind of intermediaries between humans and gods, and Dalits doing occupations that were considered ritually polluting. So Dalits did occupations that were necessary to societal life, but considered inappropriate for Hindus to undertake. For example, they were sewage workers. They removed human excrement, human waste. They were also undertakers. They removed corpses and dressed corpses and prepared them for burial or cremation. They were also leather workers historically because leather was tanned using human urine, and handling excrement was considered ritually polluting. So, caste status was based on occupation, but it was traditionally hereditary. You married within your caste, and especially Dalits were not allowed to outmarry. So even though people in higher castes could marry down in caste or up in caste and change their caste position, nobody wanted to marry a Dalit person. So Dalits had very rare opportunity to ever change their caste status. Um, Although it's important to note that the caste system existed for a very, very long time before British colonialism, um, the British really changed how the caste system operated. So during British colonial rule called the Raj, colonial governments promoted and entrenched the caste system. Uh, the British and other colonial powers have historically done this. They have promoted and exploited intergroup conflict or intergroup hierarchy within the societies they've colonized. So you can see this in Nigeria, you can see this in Kenya, you can see this all over the colonial world. So the British really reified the caste system through caste censuses. So a way to understand this is that even though everyone understood that caste existed and that they had a caste, it may not be the first thing that a person thought of about themselves. So it wasn't necessarily central to identity. You may, in fact, only think about it when you thought about what job to do or who to marry. For the British, it became a really central feature of each person. So they took caste censuses and assigned people to different positions and different occupations and different privileges depending on their perceived caste status. They promoted higher caste people above others within colonial structures. And they also did something interesting, which was they introduced colorism into the caste system. So, whereas before there could be high caste people with dark skin or low caste people with light skin, under the Raj, the British really associated dark skin with low status already. And so they associated and created an association between dark skin and low caste status, and light skin and high caste status. And we can see vestiges of this today. When sociologists study Indian matrimonial ads, they often specify what caste status they're looking for in a prospective mate. And they often advertise what color complexions they're willing to consider. Although, of course, some go out of their way to say that caste and color don't matter. So, not to say that everyone is discriminatory in their approach to these ideas, just to say there's still considerations that people make. And sometimes they explain that they don't make them. So, the caste system may have existed for a very long time, but that doesn't mean that no one ever contested it. So we're going to talk about two people who are critical of the caste system. One you're probably familiar with was Gandhi. And Gandhi wanted to improve the treatment of Dalits, of the outcast people, while still maintaining the caste system. He saw the caste system as intrinsic to what Hinduism is, and Hinduism as intrinsic to what it means to be Indian. So if you are an Indian, you are a Hindu, and you believe in the caste system. So he didn't want to do away with the caste system altogether, but he did want to make it so that Dalit people were less oppressed. He wanted to make it, in fact, against the law to commit hate crimes or status crimes against Dalit people. A different person who was actually from the Dalit caste was Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar was a medical doctor who was a political and social revolutionary leader for the Dalits. Ambedkar, in contrast to Gandhi, argued for aggressive civil rights for Dalits with specific affirmative action goals. So he actually wanted reserved seats in parliament just for Dalits, which we'll talk more about later. But not only that, Ambedkar also wanted affirmative action goals that would increase the opportunities Dalits had to hold those offices. And goals, he also wanted a parallel electorate for Dalits. That is, he said, in an open election, no one will vote for Dalits except Dalits, and they'll always be outvoted because of proportions of the population. So if we want to elect Dalits to public office, we have to have separate elections just for Dalits. So Ambedkar argued for very aggressive and revolutionary civil rights and affirmative action, targeting abuses of Dalits, but also of other lower caste folks. This was at odds with what Gandhi wanted for Indian independence. And so eventually the two men met at a place called Pua and formed the Pua Compromise, where they agreed on abolishing Dalit status altogether, but without aggressive affirmative action policies. So essentially what this compromise did was declare that no one was a Dalit anymore. And also that basically the hate crime legislation that Gandhi wanted was put into place. So if someone was from a Dalit family, you couldn't harm them in a ritualistic way because of their Dalit status. So here is a picture of Gandhi with Ambedkar. And I want to make the point that while we hear of typically one leader, for example, Gandhi, in civil rights struggles, it's important to realize that the person we hear pushed to the forefront is rarely the only voice, and that often more revolutionary thinkers are pushed to the back. So we see this over and over in the United States and civil rights movements, that kind of the more revolutionary, the more aggressive, not to say Gandhi wasn't revolutionary in his own right, but that often the more aggressive, the more radical leaders get pushed to the back, and the more moderate leaders are lionized and memorialized, or the radical parts of various leaders' philosophies are toned down and kind of sugar coated to make them seem more palatable later. So we'll talk about that more as we move on with the course. I just want you to have that concept in mind. So what ended up happening after Indian independence is that despite reservations actually being put into place for Dalits in terms of government jobs and public institutions like universities, Dalits remain severely underrepresented, and many of those reserved seats are just unfilled. And this is because of a problem of opportunity. Dalits are often concentrated in areas of disadvantage because caste was occupation based. You can imagine that people who did the work Dalits do are often concentrated in slums or in the countryside. So, for leather tanning work and such, often live in the countryside. But when they live in cities, they often live in kind of the worst parts of the city, where you would find things like garbage dumps, sewage plants, wastewater treatment, and burials. There's also the fact that Dalits have to overcome generational disadvantage and historical oppression. When your family for generations has been oppressed and denied even the most basic opportunities in life, it's very difficult to rise to positions of power. It's not impossible, and some Dalit people have done this, but the odds are against them. They have to overcome barriers that most people don't face. There's also the problem of power. Dalits lack access to political power to make meaningful change that would increase their opportunities. And high caste individuals continue to oppress lower caste people through invisible discrimination. Keep this idea of invisible or covert discrimination in mind when we talk about structural racism and color blindness later in the lecture. So I want to move on now to a reading from W.E.B. Du Bois that we were assigned this week called The Study of the Negro Problems. And I'm only going to use this word in quoting the title of the article because I want to honor what the author titled his work. But I'm going to use the term African American in place of this word, which is archaic and no longer considered polite to say for the duration, because I don't want to use this word unnecessarily. So this article is a play. The title of this article is actually a play on words, because at the time, people termed race relations and the study of race as the Negro problem, meaning how do we address the problem of Black people in America? And Du Bois said, no, it's not a problem caused by Black people. It's problems caused by racism that Black people then have to deal with. So he was reframing this narrative of the problem of Black people in America to the problems faced by Black people in America. And he says that social problems exist in the tension between ideals and reality. That when we have a goal or an ideal for our society, and we fail to achieve that ideal, we have a social problem. And thus, social problems change as social ideals change. That if we initially thought it was okay as a society for uh, women not have the right to vote, then women's disenfranchisement isn't a social problem. But if we think it's our ideal that women should be able to vote and women are facing barriers to voting, well, then we have a social problem. Um, so he says that this is the same with racism, that basically social problems exist when we have an ideal, like equality for all. All people are created equal, but we're failing to live up to that ideal. The reality is that people are desperately unequal. And so he says we have the social problem is the inequality. And he says that the problems associated with African Americans in the United States have a history connected to chattel slavery and have changed over time. So African Americans, he was writing in the late 1890s. He said the problems faced by African Americans are no longer problems of enslavement. They're now problems of unemployment, segregation, discrimination, lack of access to good things in life. The problems have changed. But that doesn't mean they've gotten better, just that they're different. The crux of Du Bois' argument here is really that there's not one problem associated with African Americans, and the problems African Americans have nothing to do with the qualities of being African American. Rather, there are many problems which African Americans experience as a result of being relegated to second-class citizenship. So he says that, in fact, this existence of second-class citizenship for African Americans is the problem, and that we have to redefine the problem thusly if we want to understand it. He said that racism arose in response to economic and political distinctions, and not the other way around. In other words, thinkers at the time, primarily white thinkers, were saying, black people are unequal and are disenfranchised and are not fit for equal citizenship because of their character, because of their behaviors. And Du Bois basically said you have causality backward. The reason that Black Americans, African Americans are not able to fully participate in the economy and in politics is because they're treated as second-class citizens, and it's a response to their economic and political oppression, not a response to their race. So he essentially, with this article, as a foundational thinker in sociology, turned the sociological narrative on race on its head, which is why I think this is a very important article. For more by Du Bois from this time period, you could read The Souls of Black Folks, which was a groundbreaking work of his, in which he really expounds a lot of his early theories. So there's more you can read by Du Bois, but I wanted to introduce this article because it, in a lot of ways, really foreshadows what Bonilla Silva says later. But also it was foundational to the sociology of race and racism. So just like Gandhi and Ambedkar, Du Bois had a contemporary who was very much at odds with his own thinking. Booker T. Washington was another kind of Black thought leader at the time that Du Bois was writing and working. They were contemporaries, and they were often at odds with each other. They agreed on many things, but as time went on and Du Bois became kind of more aggressive and more radical in his calls for reform, and Washington very much remained on the course he was on. Um, the kind of differences between them really widened. So Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He was a third generation free person of color. His grandfather had fought in the Revolutionary War and was freed as a reward. Um, Du Bois was Harvard educated and came from an elite Massachusetts black family. He was active in early civil rights movements in the United States and was aggressive in his calls for radical reform. Although earlier his ideas about how reform would happen were somewhat more regressive, um, and I'm not calling them regressive. He lived long enough to later call them regressive and to later say, wow, that was really constrained. Like what I was saying was really patronizing and really elitist, and I think better of that now. So in contrast to Du Bois, Booker T. Washington was born in Virginia as an enslaved person. When he was about 11, his mother escaped from slavery with him and moved to West Virginia, which, when the Civil War broke out, became a Union state. So he was freed from slavery, became highly educated, attending what's now Hampton University, and became famous as an educator of Black Americans. He was famously the first leader of what's now Tuskegee University, was at the time called the Tuskegee Institute. He very famously called for what he called the Atlanta Compromise, which he believed would improve the lives of African Americans through education and entrepreneurship without directly outlawing segregation and legalized discrimination. He essentially believed in the improvement of the Black community through education and entrepreneurship, and he believed that this could happen to such a degree that white people could essentially no longer continue to believe that Black people were inferior. He said, we haven't had the opportunity to prove ourselves, but we can, and white people, being reasonable, will essentially see the value of the Black community. He used the analogy of a hand and a fist. He said that socially, Black people and white people could be as separate as the fingers on a hand, moving individually, independently of each other, and keeping distance between them, but that economically and politically they could be as unified as a fist. So this was called the Atlanta Compromise, and interestingly, Du Bois actually initially endorsed this idea. It fit with Du Bois' early idea of what he called the talented tenth. The idea that the elite members of the Black community would essentially uplift the race. He later went back on this and called for more radical reforms. He co-founded the NAACP and was an early kind of proponent of what would come to be called the Civil Rights Movement. So here's a picture of Booker T. Washington on the left and W.E.B. Du Bois on the right. Du Bois outlived Booker T. Washington by quite a margin. And at the end of Du Bois' life, he was interviewed by Ralph Abernathy. And he spoke at length about his relationship and contentions with Washington, and essentially spoke of his regrets that they had never publicly reconciled. So a complicated relationship among two complex men. So this brings us to the present day, and the writings of Eduardo Bonilla Silva. So the first thing I want to talk about is Eduardo Bonilla Silva's article on structural racism, Rethinking Racism Toward a Structural Approach, which you should have read. It was written in 1997. And then we'll move on to his account of color blindness. Eduardo Bonilla Silva is an Afro-Puerto Rican sociologist. He was the president of the American Sociological Association in 2018 and continues to be a leading thinker in the sociology of race and ethnic relations. There's a very good reason that I included his text and that I'm including multiple readings of his in the course. So, Eduardo Bonilla Silva begins his article on structural racism with a thoroughgoing critique of what he sees as the mainstream views of idealist racism. Idealist here does not mean idealist, it means ideaist. So we're not thinking about ideals as in values or goals. We're thinking of ideas. Basically, the concept that racism lives as an idea in people's minds. Bonilla Silva wants to critique that assertion and wants to say, no, it's something different. It's not just a set of ideas. It's something more. So Bonilla Silva says that the mainstream views of racism are idealist or based on ideas. He says there's several problems with thinking of racism primarily as a set of ideas. The first problem is that it ignores how racism is structured into society. If we treat racism as just ideas, then we ignore the very, obvious fact that racism has been, has informed laws, has informed policies, has informed economies, has informed behavior, social behavior, that it doesn't just live in people's brains, it lives in the very structure of how we live our lives. He says another main problem with the idealist view is that it treats racism as a problem with individual people's thinking. In other words, groups of people aren't racist, societies aren't racist, just some people are racist. And he warns against what another writer, Ijeoma Oluo, will go on to call racist hunting. That if we think of racism as an idea, then the main task we have to undertake is to find people who have those ideas and root those ideas out. And Bonilla Silva says that's not what racism is. It's not a problem with individual people's thinking. He says another problem with the idealist view is that it views racism as wrong-headed and irrational thinking. That people who are racist are just mistaken. That they just think things that don't make any sense. And that if we reason with people who hold racist ideas, we can eliminate racism. If we just teach people who have racist ideas the error of their ways, we'll cease to have racism. And he says that is a misconception. That's not accurate. He says another problem with idealist thinking is that it treats racism as static over time, which makes sense if you think of racism as an idea. The idea of racism is the idea of the inequality of some group, or the inferiority of some groups. And that idea doesn't really change very much from time to time. But he says the problem is that racism manifests differently over time. And that racism today doesn't look like racism looked in the 1960s or even the 1860s. It can look different. And if we think of it as static and unchanging, then we're going to mistakenly think that we're making a lot of progress. that we may not be making. He basically, if we say, well, look, we don't have Jim Crow segregation anymore, racism doesn't look like it looked in the 1960s, look how much progress we've made. But he says people in the 1960s could have said the same thing. Look, we don't have slavery and disenfranchisement anymore. Look how far we've come. He says another problem is that racism is treated as an original sin. In other words, it's treated as a hangover from a bygone era. It's treated as something that was a problem a long, long time ago, and some people still hang on to those ideas. And that's the problem. And that if we can purge this original sin, these wrong-headed ideas, then we'll get rid of racism effectively. And I really used to buy into this idea of racism as a thinker. I bought into the idea that like racism would just die out. That if we just quit teaching people racist ideas, the people who thought that would eventually die and nobody would buy it anymore. Problem solved. And you know, reading Du Bois and Bonilla Silva really like shook that up for me, and I realized that was not the problem. More on that in a moment. Bonilla Silva also says that another problem with idealist views is that racism is treated as an overt behavior. We can easily tell who's racist, the theory goes, because they're the people using racial slurs. They're the people marching with tiki torches. They're the people, getting in fights with people at the bar. They're the racists. And if we deal with them and teach them the error of their ways, then we don't have to worry about racism anymore. He also says, and this is a little harder to follow, so I'm going to try to break it down for us, that a problem with idealist views of racism is that racism is analyzed in a circular manner. That we believe racist behavior is a result of racist ideas. And we know people have racist ideas when they do racist behaviors. So racist behaviors are evidence of racism because racism causes racist behaviors, and it's just a tautology. Tautology means like a circle in reasoning, right? So it's just a circle. He says, and we never get anywhere with it. So he proposes an understanding of structural racism based on an understanding of racialized social systems. I want to really emphasize this point of racialized social systems. It's the key to understanding everything that comes next. His definition of a racialized social system is a society in which economic, political, social, and ideological levels are at least partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories or races. So he says it's not necessary that race be the sole determining factor of economic, political, social, and ideological standing. It's enough that it be a determining factor or an influence. He points out that we have to understand that other factors such as class and gender also play a role. But that at least some of it can be attributed to race. At least some inequality in economic, political, social, and ideological levels of society can be explained by putting people into racial categories. And he says this is so because racial categories are always hierarchical. He said while ethnic situations can exist where different ethnic groups just live in harmony alongside one another and there's no hierarchy, that a racial system is inherently hierarchical. That there's always a group at the top who gets more economic, political, social, and ideological consideration, and a group at the bottom who gets less of all those things. He says because race racial categories are hierarchical, it creates racial groups. And racial groups, therefore, have collective interests. So if I'm part of a system that puts me in a racialized category, um, and then promotes me above other people in terms of economics, politics, social status, and ideologies, meaning beliefs about what kind of person I am, then I have a collective interest with other people like me, with other members of my group. Um, I'm benefiting a lot from the system. The system is making me and people like me have a much better life than people who are not like us. And therefore, racist behavior isn't wrong-headed or irrational as the idealist view would have it. Instead, racist behavior becomes really rational and self-interested. If I'm in a system where I'm benefiting a lot, it's rational for me to want to hang on to that. I'm acting in self-interest when I try to keep the system in place. I'm not being illogical. I'm being mean, and selfish, but I'm not being stupid. I'm acting in naked self-interest. He also says that in a racialized system, racism doesn't have to be overt. It can be covert because it's part of the very normal functioning of the social system. Uh, think about um, think about driving a car. The car is meant to move forward when I press the gas. I don't have to do it. Even in neutral, it will slowly move forward. I don't really have to do anything overt to make the car go. I'm very subtly just applying a little pressure with my foot to make the car go forward. Unless I do something actively to stop moving the car, like slam on the brakes, it's going to keep going. It's going to keep operating just as it operates. So he said there's this kind of like, the system already tends to be racist. The system was built with racial interests in mind and will just continue being racist if we do nothing to stop it being racist. So I don't have to be racist outwardly to do racist things. I give an example of a nonprofit that I used to work in where I was not responsible for hiring and firing, but I was responsible for screening job applicants and promoting their resumes and their applications for interviews. So I wasn't in charge of who ultimately got the job, but I was in charge of who got an interview. And I was told that while giving people tours and participating in the interview process, that I should let the hiring manager know whether the person expressed a strong belief in Christianity. It was a Christian nonprofit, and I was told, we really need to know if they're evangelical Christians. If they don't express, alignment with those values, I need to know about it. And I said, well, we're a faith-based nonprofit, so really, as long as they sign the mission statement, we can't discriminate based on religious affiliation or religious belief. Like, isn't that unethical? And the hiring manager kind of smirked and said, there's always a reason not to hire somebody. In other words, we don't have to tell them, we're not hiring you because you're not Christian enough. We can just say there was a more qualified applicant. Or we can just say, thank you, but we won't be moving forward. In other words, the system was already set up so that we didn't have to tell people, we're not hiring you because you don't align with our religious values enough. There was a system in place to just allow us to do that. It could be very covert. I did not last in that job. It was not a good fit. So the other thing Bonilla Silva says about structural racism is that it's a current issue, not a past problem. And this is related to the next point, which is that manifestations of racism can change over time. He says, the idealist view would have it that ideas are static. Like thinking racist thoughts looks the same no matter when you think them. Bonilla Silva says yes, but how those racist thoughts are acted out and how they're structured into society changes over time as social conditions change and as social norms change. So, boy, did it used to not be a problem to use racial slurs for other people. You could just use them. People used them on the news, people used them in polite conversation, people used racial slurs all the time without hesitation. Now, that's considered unacceptable. Our social norms have changed so that we can't use racial slurs anymore openly. Although people still do it, they're making an overt statement. They're saying, I'm racist and I don't care who knows it. Most people, even if they have racist ideas, don't say racial slurs anymore. But that doesn't mean their racism doesn't exist. It means the way we're allowed to express racism has changed. And so Bonilla Silva says we have to be careful that we're not saying we've made progress when what we've done is change what's appropriate outward behavior. So one thing we could discuss on Thursday that I just want to put out there ahead of time is we could talk about how the persistence of the caste system, as described by Aulet, relates to Bonilla Silva's argument about structural racism. So, moving on from the 1997 article on structural racism, I want to talk about the chapters, the introduction and the first chapter of Racism Without Racists. So, you might pause the video here and ask yourself if you can remember what the 4 central frames of colorblindness are before I discuss them one at a time. That would be a good check for understanding. So I'm going to talk through them now. The 4 central frames of colorblindness are abstract liberalism, naturalization, cultural racism, and minimization. And Bonilla Silva says that when he says frames, what he means are pathways for interpreting information. These are essentially standpoints from which we can analyze information about racism and reach conclusions. So the first one, abstract liberalism, is used to make racism seem reasonable. It's based in European humanism, which emphasizes the idea that every person determines their own destiny. Every person has free will, and the duty of society is to make sure that people are not overly constrained, that people are not held back from enacting their will and living their destiny. Bonilla Silva calls this laissez-faire racism, where laissez-faire essentially means let it be, but it's become associated in the United States with laissez-faire capitalism. The idea that essentially the government shouldn't intervene in the free market. The government shouldn't put limits on the free market. So laissez-faire racism then is essentially the idea that the government shouldn't intervene to fix racial inequality because individuals have freedom of choice and can choose what kind of education to pursue, what kind of jobs to apply for, where to live, where to attend school, how hard to study, how hard to work, how to spend their money, how to save their money. Individuals have free choice, and so the government shouldn't interfere with how things turn out. This depends on the idea that there's equality of opportunity, that everyone within the system has essentially the same opportunities to achieve the good things in life. And laissez-faire, or people who embrace kind of abstract liberalism, argue we absolutely have equality of opportunity. It's illegal to segregate schools. It's illegal to keep someone out of college or university because of their race. It's illegal to have segregated workplaces. Um, and while that may be true in terms of law, it's absolutely not true in reality. Schools are more segregated now than they were in the 1980s. And while, yes, colleges can't keep students out because of race, uh, there are many inequalities in education that persist, including, the fact that when students of color are admitted to college, they're more likely to be commuter students, they're more likely to be first generation students, they're more likely to be more heavily indebted, and they often don't fare as well as white students in the institutions. People who embrace abstract liberalism would say essentially that's okay. They don't have to end up as well. Things don't have to turn out as well for everybody. Um, People just have to have the same opportunities. But the question becomes, are opportunities really equal? So I want to the key question I would like you to consider here, and you may choose to discuss this on Thursday. You may choose to include it in your journal entry, but I'd like you to think: what is the difference between equity and equality, between equality of opportunity and true equity? So maybe you want to look up those words and think about how they differ. Maybe you want to take cues from the readings, but I'd like us to discuss this question on Thursday and maybe write about it. The second central frame is the frame of naturalization. It makes racism seem like a natural preference. So this is often a frame applied to segregation and kind of all white spaces and concentrated disadvantage for people of color. So here's how this might look. This might look like, why is your church entirely white? Well, everybody likes to be with people like themselves. Look, they're all black churches. Segregation is just based on personal preferences on everyone's part. Everyone just prefers to be with people they feel comfortable around who are like them. And the problem with this frame is that it ignores the differences in people's realities that might lead to the same choice. So, for example, why might white people like to be with other white people most of the time? I have actually asked people this, and there's research on it, and it suggests that white people are frequently afraid of being embarrassed, afraid of accidentally saying something racially insensitive and being challenged about it, afraid that they can't say what they really think if people of color are around. Where when people of color tend to prefer, single race spaces or spaces specifically for people of color, they often describe just not wanting to feel misunderstood, not wanting to feel like a spokesperson for their group, not wanting to feel singled out. And wanting to be with people who believe and relate with their experiences. So even though it may be true to some degree that people often prefer to be around people like them, that may mean very different things and be motivated by very different agendas for different kinds of folks. So I'm not saying that people actually do have this preference. But in cases when this preference may exist, we need to consider power differentials that could inform those choices. So the question here is, what may motivate white people wanting to be with others like themselves, and how might that differ from what motivates people of color? We also have the frame of cultural racism. Cultural racism makes racism seem like a cultural phenomenon. Essentially, it attributes racial inequality to group differences in behavior. And differences in behavior may not be real at all. They may be made up completely, or they may mistake causality. Here's an example. How many of you have heard? We know Mexican people live in poverty because they're lazy. They don't work as hard, and they don't value education in the same way. Now, I think it's real funny that the same people taking our jobs and working for wages white people won't accept are also lazy. You can't have it both ways, but it attributes racial inequality. Latinx people frequently live in poverty to group differences in behavior. They're lazy. Now, the differences in behavior in this case are made up completely. But often what's used to call a group of people lazy is unemployment. This can be a case of mistaken causality. It may not be that they're unemployed because they don't want to work. It may be that they're unemployed because of discrimination. So racism causes unemployment, not unemployment causing racial inequality. So it attributes to the effects of racism to cultural differences. This closely relates to how Aulet describes essentialism and racial essentialism. It takes a group difference, a real or perceived group difference in behavior, and makes it essential to who a person is or what a group is like. So the final frame of colorblindness is minimization. Minimization is used to make racism seem irrelevant. It often interprets that racism as better than it used to be, and argues that racism is exaggerated or not as bad as people of color say it is. How this might look is a student complaining about a racial microaggression, and someone telling them, oh, you think that's racism? I don't think it's even appropriate to call that racism. Racism is when the police turn the water hoses on black people and stick dogs on black people. And you're saying that someone, calling you articulate is racism. That's not racism. Another way this might look is a person of color expressing a negative experience with racism, expressing that, something bad happened to them or something happening to them is racist, and someone basically not believing them and saying, you have to make everything about race. Or, oh my God, you always play the race card. As if racism or experiences of racism are a gambit that people of color can use to get attention or to create trouble or to avoid responsibility rather than, a thoroughgoing oppressive system. So minimization is often used to dismiss assertions about racism, and is a very prevalent tactic. It's a very common and popular way that people address racism, is by saying it's not as bad as it used to be, therefore you shouldn't worry about it, or it's not as bad as you say it is, therefore I don't believe you. So these are what Bonilla Silva calls the central frames of colorblindness. And we're going to revisit these throughout the rest of the term. So the question might be, obviously the answer of who benefits from minimization of racism is going to be not people of color. But how does minimization of racism benefit people who practice it? Um, so I want us to end there for today and look forward to the rest of the week and then next week. So this week, in addition to watching this lecture, you're going to take reading quiz 2. You're going to write journal entry 2, and we're going to meet at 12:30 on Thursday via Teams. Reading quiz 2 and journal entry 2 will be due Thursday at 5. Next week, believe it or not, it's time to take the first exam. You're going to have a take-home exam that's going to be due on Friday. It will be a combination of essay and short answer questions, and a little warning that it will cover the material taught next week as well. It's due Friday, but I'll ask you to incorporate some ideas from next Tuesday's lecture. So I'm going to try to post that lecture by Thursday so that you can watch it a little early. And you may want to go ahead and get a jump on next week's readings so you can go over those for the exam. We will still meet on Thursday. You can ask me questions and then plan to take the exam on Friday, or you can make appointments to talk to me before. So just give some thought to how you want to prepare for the test and how I can help. That is all I have for today. I will see you on Teams on Thursday.